Chapter 9. Calvin wanted to kick something. The trip would take 18 hours by train, but he couldn't leave for another 4 hours when the next train came through. What was he going to do? It would do him no good to set out toward Chicago on his horse. He would get there faster by waiting for the next train. He felt helpless and desperately wished he hadn't asked Slater to help him instead of staying with Eliza that afternoon. What had he been thinking? He shook his head. An hour. What could happen in an hour? He could lose his wife and child. That's what could happen in an hour. He rode home quickly so he could update Beulah on the events of the day and make sure she was well guarded. Eliza won't let me ever forget it if something happens to you while I'm off chasing after her, he told her. Beulah nodded, her eyes red and swollen. I'll make sure everything is all right here. You just get my sister back. I will. He headed to the bunkhouse on the other side of his property and explained the situation. We'll take turns guarding your sister and the boys, Slater told him, speaking for the others. Thank you. I'll be back as soon as I can. Calvin thought about going next door to talk to his neighbor about the situation, but he wasn't willing to take the time. He wrote a quick note for Stanley Bond before heading back into town to catch his train to Chicago. Asterisk. By the time Eliza stepped off the train in Chicago, she was exhausted. She'd been awake for more than 24 hours and had been able to hold nothing in her stomach the entire ride. Sebastian had purchased food for her, not out of the goodness of his heart, but to keep her healthy enough to work. She'd vomited every bite. Once she was off the train, she breathed in the air. It wasn't as fresh as at home, but it was better than the stale air on the train. She left the train carefully holding Sebastian's arm as he'd instructed, her eyes scanning the crowd. She knew there was no way Calvin could have arrived ahead of her, but she had to look for him. As she looked, she realized there were several men throughout the crowd watching her carefully. Sebastian wasn't paying any attention to her. He was asking where a livery was so he could hire a buggy for their time in Chicago. She mouthed the words, "Help me." One of the men gave her a nod to indicate he understood. The livery is just down the street, dear. It won't hurt you to walk that far with me. Sebastian looked down at her with a smile. He patted her hand in an almost loving manner, and she felt nauseated once again. He was playing the part of a loving husband, and his look of love made her more than slightly ill. I need to use the outhouse. She knew he hated it when she used the word outhouse in his presence, and that's the only reason she didn't find a more delicate way of saying it. Maybe if she made him angry enough, he'd just send her back to Missouri. The flush of anger crossed his face. I'm sure you can wait until we reach our hotel, my love. Did you forget that I'm carrying? I can't wait even 5 minutes lately. She gave him a sweet smile, knowing it would make him crazy. There was no way she was going to a hotel with him immediately. She'd separate from him and pray that she hadn't been wrong about the men in the crowd. I'll wait for you, sweetheart. After all, I'm the one who got you in the family way. He walked with her to the back of the train station and straight to the outhouse. As she turned to close the door, she saw 2 of the men who had been watching them get off the train close in on him. She quickly locked the door, hoping they'd be able to apprehend him before she needed to leave. She couldn't hide in the outhouse forever. After a moment, she heard Sebastian shout, "Get off me, you fool!" She smiled, waiting another minute before opening the door and peering out. Sebastian was in handcuffs, and there was a man flanking him on either side. One of them tipped his hat to her. You must be the woman Walton Dalton telegraphed about, ma'am. Eliza's eyes widened. Yes, I am. I was afraid he didn't believe me when he got off the train at the next stop. She was so thankful to Walton Dalton. He may have a terrible name, but he was a good person. Oh, he believed you all right, ma'am. Are you all right? The man was stocky with brown hair. He wore a badge pinned to his shirt. She was surprised she hadn't noticed the badge earlier. I'm fine. Thank you so much. I wasn't expecting anyone to be here waiting for me. Eliza wanted to cry with relief. She could go home. She hoped she could go home at least. As if he could read her mind, the man said, "We're going to need you to come to the station to give a report, ma'am. Are you up to doing that now, or do you need some time?" "I just want to go home." She sighed. "If I give the report immediately, can I go home?" She said a silent prayer. He'd answer in the affirmative. Nothing sounded as nice as having Calvin's arms wrapped around her. The man shook his head. "I'm afraid not, ma'am. I'll need you to stay in town until his trial." Eliza closed her eyes. "How long will that take?" "Depends on him, ma'am. If he confesses today, it'll be over in a matter of hours. If he insists on a lawyer, then we could be looking at months. I'm expecting. I want to be home with my husband." She looked at Sebastian, all at once angrier with him than she'd ever been. "It wasn't enough that I sang for you for 16 years? You couldn't let me be happy?" She wanted to kick him and even brought her foot back to do so, but she knew it wasn't the answer. It would have made her feel better for a minute or two, though. Sebastian looked at her and their eyes met. "I'll be prosecuted either way. Your sister saw me put a gun to her son's head. I'll sign a statement of confession." Eliza almost couldn't believe her ears. For once in his life, he was doing the right thing and making things easier for her. "I'll go to the station now and make my statement then. Thank you for making this easier for me." She didn't want to be polite to him, but manners were too ingrained to not thank him. "The station's just a 5-minute walk. Just walk over with us, and we'll take your statement. You're free to go home then." He gripped Sebastian's arm solidly. "I'm Sam Kreider, by the way." "Thank you for your help, Mr. Kreider." She was thankful to have a kind man who was helping her. "It's Sheriff Kreider, ma'am." He led the way to a small building that was really less than a 5-minute walk. She followed him inside, hating the smell of sweat and stale cigar smoke that assaulted her as she walked in. She made a face as her stomach rumbled, thankful she had nothing in her stomach to throw up again. She followed him into a small office and sat down at the table. The smell wasn't quite as bad there. She went through the questioning process with Sebastian and Sheriff Kreider. It took longer than she would have wanted, but she couldn't refuse to do it and expect Sebastian to still be prosecuted. She wished Calvin were there. At least she knew her sister was safe at the ranch. Asterisk. Calvin rushed off the train, determined to find his wife. He ran to the first uniformed person he saw, not caring that he was just someone who sold tickets for the trains. "My wife was kidnapped. She's an opera singer, and I believe her kidnapper is going to force her to sing here in town. Can you point me in the direction of where an opera singer would perform?" The man stared at him blankly for a moment. "I believe she's at the police station, sir." There was a big ruckus and a man was arrested. "They caught him?" His heart skipped a beat. If they'd caught him, then she was safe. He needed to know she was safe. If it's the same man. "I don't think there have been 2 kidnapping victims on our trains today." The ticket taker walked toward the small enclosure where he'd put up a sign saying he'd be back in 5 minutes. "I hope not at least," he muttered. "Can you tell me how to get to the police station then?" Calvin asked. If Eliza was waiting for him at the police station, he'd be thrilled. He had to find her. Calvin received his directions, and once he realized how close she was, he broke into a dead run. He threw open the door to the station and looked around for his wife. "Can I help you with something, sir?" A young man who didn't look old enough to shave more than once a week stood in front of him. Calvin nodded. "Yes, I'm trying to find my wife. I was told she may be here." "She was kidnapped." He looked around the large room trying to spot her. Oh, yes. We all saw her come in. She just left. The sheriff put her up in the Chicago Inn for the night. It's right next door. She's planning on being on the first train back to Missouri in the morning. Calvin rushed from the station. He looked around and spotted the Chicago Inn and made his way to the front desk. I believe my wife just checked in here. Hopefully the young man at the station had been right. Her name? The man at the desk looked bored, as if he'd dealt with one too many people that day. He was middle-aged with a large bald spot on top of his head. What little hair he had was blonde. Eliza Simpson. Calvin looked around the lobby of the hotel, hoping that he would spot his wife. Of course he knew she wouldn't be in the lobby, but he had to try. Oh yes, sir. I put her in room 37. The desk clerk waved his hand. It's up the stairs and to the right. Thank you. Calvin hurried through the hotel and finally stopped at the door. His beautiful wife was waiting behind. He knocked and waited. Who is it? Eliza had been through enough. She wasn't ever going to open a door when she didn't know who was behind it again. Open the door, sweetheart. Eliza flung the door open and threw herself into his arms. She'd held up very well through both the kidnapping and the statement she had to make to the police. Now that she was with Calvin, she let loose. She began shaking immediately, and tears welled up in her eyes. Calvin wrapped his arms around her. Let's go in. When she didn't move, he bent down and scooped her up in his arms and carried her inside. He laid her gently on the bed and removed his shoes before following her and lying beside her, holding her tightly. I'm sorry I couldn't get to you sooner, he whispered. She sniffled loudly, burying her face in his neck, her hands clinging to his back. I couldn't do anything. He wouldn't let me out of his sight. She'd never felt so helpless in her life. Calvin stroked her back, trying his best to soothe her. He'd never had a crying woman in his arms before, and he wasn't entirely certain what to do. I'm here now. I'm here. Someone should give lessons in how to comfort a crying woman. Why didn't they teach that in school? Finally, she cried herself out and looked at him. What about Beulah? And Ted and Jack? Are they safe? Yes, they're at the ranch, and the men have organized to guard them 24 hours per day. They're fine. He wasn't worried about her family. She was safe, and that was what mattered to him. She used the back of her arm to indelicately wipe all the tears from her face. Have you found her a husband yet? He let out a bark of laughter. I decided to wait with that until I got you back. We'll do it together. He pressed a kiss atop her head. We'll find one for her soon. Eliza said nothing else as she settled into his arms, and after a minute or two he realized she was asleep. They'd be on the first train home the following day, and she'd get to see for herself that her sister was safe. He hated that she'd gone through so much without him beside her. Never again would she be left alone. Asterisk. When they pulled into the train station in Poudville, Eliza let out a sigh of relief. The long train ride had left her exhausted. She couldn't keep anything in her stomach when the train moved. She wished there was a restaurant in town, but there wasn't. She'd go home and cook for them. I left my horse at the livery, so if you don't mind riding double again, we can go straight home. Calvin eyed her carefully. She looked like she was about to fall over. Once he had his horse saddled and had mounted it, he leaned down to help her up, grasping her wrist so she could put her foot atop his in the stirrup. He settled her back against him, riding slowly so she could sleep. When they arrived home, Eliza hurried to the house as he cared for his horse and put him in the stable. She opened the door, having noticed a light in the kitchen. Beulah was at the work table whipping up batter for pancakes. I hope you're making enough for all of us, she said. She was so thankful she wouldn't have to cook, She had no words to express it. She'd done altogether too little sleeping and too much vomiting since the last time she'd been in her home. Beulah set the bowl down before moving across the room and throwing herself at her sister. "You're safe. I was so worried. Thank God you're all right." Eliza smiled, clinging to Beulah. "Thank a man named Walton Dalton I met on the train." She watched her sister's face as she said the name. "Walton Dalton? Are you serious?" Beulah stepped back, shaking her head. "I'm going to finish cooking. You sit at the table and tell me all about Walton Dalton. I hope he was the 15th child, and his parents had just run out of names. Isn't it awful?" Eliza sat down, resting her head on one elbow. If she wasn't so hungry, she'd go straight to bed, but she knew she needed food first. She'd been up all night, throwing up on the train. She briefly told the story of how she'd run into Walton Dalton on the train and what he'd done for her. "Sebastian stopped me before I could quiz him about his name." She knew she'd always wonder about it. How could a parent do that to a child? "Well, it would have been rude, so I'm glad Sebastian stopped you." Beulah poured 8 perfect round pancakes onto the skillet she'd heated. "I'm so thankful he listened to you and telegraphed the authorities. I was surprised to see so many men watching us in Chicago. I just ducked into the outhouse, and by the time I got out, they'd arrested Sebastian. I'd have come straight home, but they needed me to make a statement. And I needed to eat and sleep. The train and the baby combined did not do well for me." She didn't describe her nausea, but she knew her sister would understand what she meant. "Baby? You're expecting?" Beulah spun and looked at her sister, forgetting the pancakes for a moment. "You're really carrying?" Eliza smiled and nodded. "I really am. You're going to be an auntie." Her hand went automatically to her belly, as it always did when the baby was mentioned. She wasn't certain why she did that, but it seemed the most natural thing to do. "Oh, that's wonderful." Beulah turned back just in time to flip the pancakes. "Is your stomach all right now? Can you eat?" "I'm famished. Thank you for cooking for us." "Is Calvin with you?" Beulah asked with surprise. "He left for Chicago, but I wasn't sure how he'd find you in a city that big." "Yes, they told him at the police station where I was staying." Eliza yawned as Beulah put a plate with 4 pancakes on it in front of her. The butter and maple syrup were already there. She quickly added the toppings and said a silent prayer. "They're delicious. You need to help me learn to make pancakes like you do. I have a recipe for the batter, but I always make them look funny when I try to flip them." She could never get the hang of doing it the way Beulah did. She loved her sister, but Beulah always made her feel inept in the kitchen. "Oh, it hadn't occurred to me that you're cooking now. How's that going for you?" Beulah's eyes were twinkling as she poured 8 more pancakes. Eliza swallowed the bite her in mouth while glaring at her sister. "I try. I can outsing you any day, big sister." "I know you can. I was always relieved to be better than you at something." Beulah's voice turned serious. "How long are we going to be able to stay with you? There's room now, but once the baby is born, we'll need to be gone. We'll find you a husband quickly. The men in this town are all desperate for wives. You'll have your pick of them, I'm sure." She couldn't wait to see her sister happy again. Now that she was happily married, she wanted to see the whole world matched up and as happy as she was. "A widow with 2 sons? I think you're overestimating my charms as well as the desperation of the men here in town." Beulah piled the pancakes on a plate and hurriedly poured more. Calvin walked into the house and took the plate Beulah had made for him, taking the seat across from his wife. "Thanks," he muttered. "Who's been milking the cow?" Beulah turned to her new brother-in-law, really seeing him for the first time. She'd been too distraught when they met to notice anything about him. "Ted has." He and Jack have been working hard to do everything they should to keep the ranch going while you're gone. They love it here. We all appreciate you taking us in this way." Calvin swallowed the bite he'd just taken and sat back. "Well, we'll make sure they end up with a good father then. I know several men who would do just about anything to marry a woman like you." He loved the woman's cooking, but he wanted to be in his house alone with his bride again soon. Beulah frowned. "I'm plump and have 2 boys. Who would want me? Half the men in town at least. I don't think you have any idea how scarce women are around here." He took a sip of the coffee Beulah put in front of him. "We'll introduce you around at church on Sunday, and I'll be surprised if you don't have at least 4 offers to court that day, if not a marriage proposal or 2. Eliza yawned again, pushing the last of her food away from her. "I'm done. I'm going to go on up to bed and sleep for a couple of hours." She looked over at her sister. "Would you be sure to wake me before 11? That way, I'll have time to fix lunch." Beulah shook her head. "I'll fix lunch. I'll wake you at noon to eat." Eliza was too tired to argue. She undressed and climbed into bed, not caring how long she slept. She and the baby both needed to catch up. Asterisk. Sunday came altogether too soon for Eliza. She and Beulah spent hours in the kitchen with Beulah teaching her all the tips and tricks to cooking she'd learned over the years. They'd been raised by the same mother, but because Eliza had so many solos at church, she'd gotten out of much of the housework to practice. She happily introduced her sister to everyone she knew after church. It took only a minute or 2 for her to realize that a line had formed for introductions, and women were conspicuously absent from the line. Calvin had been right. All of the men were interested in courting Beulah. Eliza met their neighbor, Charles Hampton, for the first time that afternoon when he joined the line to meet Beulah. "What are you doing this afternoon, Mrs. Morgan?" "I'd be happy to take you and your boys for a drive." The man looked at her earnestly, obviously hoping he would be the one chosen to drive with them that afternoon. She wondered if Charles would have made himself known to her sooner if he'd known she had a widowed sister who was in the market for a husband. The boys were off playing in the churchyard with the other children, but every time a man expressed interest in her, Beulah made certain to mention that she had 2 boys. Eliza was ready to laugh at the way each man made it very clear he didn't care if there were 12 children involved as long as he got a wife. "I have no plans for the afternoon, Mr. Hampton. I'll see if my sister can spare me from the housework." Beulah looked over at Eliza, her expression devoid of emotion. Eliza couldn't tell whether she wanted to go with him or not. Eliza grinned. "Of course I can. Charles Hampton is our closest neighbor. I'd love if you went for a drive with him this afternoon. He could show you the area." She wanted her sister as close as possible, and she couldn't be closer than next door. She knew she was being obvious, but at that moment she didn't care. Beulah blushed knowing that it sounded like her sister was pushing her at Mr. Hampton. "I'd be happy to. What time is good for you, Mrs. Morgan?" "Any time after 2 should be fine. That gives me time to help with the lunch dishes before the boys and I leave with you." Charles smiled and nodded. "I'll be counting the minutes." Eliza noticed that Beulah was watching her neighbor's bottom as he left the church. "I think lusting in church just compounds the sin." Beulah pushed her sister a bit while blushing. "Behave yourself." "I've been very well behaved." Eliza caught Calvin's eye across the church and thought she'd done some of her own lusting in church, so she'd keep quiet. Chapter 10. Eliza questioned Calvin early Monday morning about the guard that was still always positioned outside the barn watching the house. "I'm safe. Beulah's here. Why is there still a guard?" She was going to go crazy if she wasn't allowed to roam freely soon. If she wanted to take a walk, Slater walked with her. If she wanted to go to town, Slater went with her. It was enough to make a woman mad. Calvin shook his head. We still don't know where the threat letters were coming from. Until we do, the guard will have to stay where he is. He hated that he couldn't give her the answer he knew she wanted, but he'd hate even more to find her hurt. Eliza wrinkled her nose. But Beulah's here, Sebastian's in jail, and we have Spot. Couldn't he see she finally felt safe? Calvin looked at the puppy who was chasing his tail. Spot's not going to be much help for at least another year. Why had he agreed to get her a puppy again? The little mutt was insane. I just won't sing, Calvin. We're going to be fine. How could he not see she needed him to change his mind? I feel safer with him there. Eliza sighed. Fine, but we're taking the boys to enroll them in school this morning. Slater will drive you. I need supplies as well. Is he going to drive me into town and carry my purchases? She knew she was being unreasonable, but she hated being watched over so closely. Yes, he will. Calvin kissed her softly. I know you don't like it, but until we hear back from Mr. Bigelow, you will be with a guard or with me at all times. He left the house, leaving her to make a face at the door. Sometimes being childish was the only answer. What threat letters? Beulah asked. Oh, I didn't know you were there, Eliza told her. She hadn't yet told the full truth about the threats made on her sister and nephews, because she felt like they were safe now that they were in Missouri. She wasn't singing, and she knew where her sister was at all times, so there was no reason for anyone to hurt her, was there? What threat letters? Beulah made it clear she wasn't about to let the subject drop. Eliza sighed. Let's go into the parlor, and I'll explain. She led her sister into the room that was almost never used and sat down on the love seat. When Beulah took the armchair perpendicular to her, Eliza explained. I was in Massachusetts when I got the first one. It was pressed into my hand as I was hurrying to the women's waiting room at the train station there. I never saw who gave it to me. It said if I didn't stop singing, you and the boys would be in danger. She hated to admit that her sister and her boys had been in danger because of her singing. She had felt guilty since the first letter. Beulah's eyes widened. Me? I thought the letters were threatening you. No. You and the boys. They knew where you were, because they gave me the name of your town in New York, so I decided to escape from Sebastian. I hated being on the road and wanted to get away from him anyway. So when I heard a woman saying she couldn't take the train to be a mail-order bride, I jumped at the chance. I took her tickets and came out here to marry her groom, Calvin Simpson. She hated admitting she'd met Calvin as his default bride. It made her feel like she was less than adequate. But, you weren't supposed to be his bride? You seem so right for each other. Eliza smiled. He's a good man. I got here and married him that day, knowing I needed to hide out. I went back to my real name, which took some getting used to. I'd been Langelina for so long, I almost forgot who I was. She shrugged. I'd been here almost a month when I sang in church for the first and only time. The pastor asked me to sing Silent Night for the Christmas morning service. Oh, I love that song. You've always sung it beautifully. Do you remember when I was 12 and you were 10, and you sang it on Christmas morning back in upstate New York? Eliza grinned at the memory. Yes, but when I sang it then, no one heard me and contacted Sebastian. She looked down at her hands. I got a letter a few weeks later threatening you and the boys again. The letter said I can't even sing in church. Whoever it was knows I'm here, and I have to believe they know you're here too. If I don't sing in public again, you should be fine though. She hated that her sister and her nephews were in danger because of her. They had to find the man who was threatening them. Calvin was right. Beulah sat back for a moment stunned. But you have to sing in church. God gave you your beautiful voice so that you can share it with others. Not so you can hide it away. I can't risk your life. How could Beulah not see how important she was? Beulah sighed. I'm not going to take the boys to school until this is settled. I don't want them apart from me. I'll teach them at home, and they can do chores around the ranch. Learning to be ranchers can only help them in life. So I guess poor Slater is going to be driving us all to town today. Eliza wrinkled her nose. She hated the idea of shopping with the boys. Beulah laughed. No, we'll send the boys out to learn about ranching from their Uncle Calvin while we shop. Eliza's face lit up. Oh, I like that idea a lot. Asterisk. Eliza was surprised by the large crowd standing in front of the mercantile that afternoon. Why had so many hard-working men left their ranches on a Monday morning? She'd never seen anything like it. As they got closer, she heard someone call out, "I'll take 10 raffle tickets." Eliza looked at Slater. Go see what they're raffling off. I might want to buy a ticket. She hadn't seen that big a crowd in town except on Sundays. Whatever they were raffling must be good. I can't do that unless you promise to stay put. Both of you need to remain in this wagon until I come back. Do you understand me? Eliza nodded. I'm not going to do anything stupid. I promise. She might if she were alone, but she would never risk her sister. The two sisters watched as Slater walked over to the edge of the crowd and questioned a man there. He came back looking like he was torn between wanting to laugh and being disgusted. You ladies do not want to know. He walked over to help Eliza down before taking Beulah's hand and helping her. What are they raffling? Eliza asked. Beulah. Slater closed his eyes as he waited for the storm to hit. What? They can't raffle off my sister. What were they thinking? Did they not realize they couldn't make a woman a prize? Beulah's jaw dropped. They're trying to buy me? To make me a prize in some kind of contest? Well, you wouldn't be their slave or anything. They're selling raffle tickets to decide who gets to marry you. He looked disgusted to have to admit to what the other men were doing. I will not be raffled off. Beulah hurried off before Slater could stop her, rushing to the man who held the tickets and a wad of money. She snatched the money from his hand before anyone could stop her. I need your attention, gentlemen. The noise was so loud no one could hear her. She looked over and saw Eliza beside her. Get their attention, please. Eliza took a deep breath and sang the highest note she could possibly sing without straining. After years of practice and training, she could hold a note for a long time, and gradually all the noise died down around her as the men stopped talking and realized who was standing there. When she heard not another sound from the men, she quieted. Now that I have your attention, I need to make an announcement, Beulah said. I will not be raffled off. Those of you who have spent your hard-earned money buying raffle tickets trying to become my husband are out of luck. The church thanks you for your donation. Now get back to work. If you want the chance to be my husband, you may court me like a normal man. I will not be disrespected this way. Good day. It was all she could do not to kick the man who'd been selling the tickets. What did he think gave him the right? They watched as the crowd slowly dispersed, several of the men grumbling about her keeping their money. I spent $10 whole on tickets. That's a lot of money. I told you to spend your money on perfume and chocolate instead. You should have listened to me, his companion mumbled as they both walked off. Eliza was torn between laughter and tears. One thing was certain. Calvin was right about the men all wanting her sister for their wife. The boys didn't deter them one bit. Asterisk. When they got back to the ranch, they barely had time to make lunch. They had more supplies which they'd needed, but no time to use them. Let's just do a quick meal of bacon, scrambled eggs, and toast, Beulah suggested. We'll make something good for supper to make up for it. Eliza nodded. You do the toast and bacon, and I'll make the eggs. She had the bowl against her stomach, mixing the eggs, when she heard a knock on the door. She walked over and called through the door, not willing to open it without knowing. "It's Slater, ma'am. There's a Mr. Bigelow here to see you." Eliza opened the door wide. "Come in, Mr. Bigelow. Do you have news for me?" She led him to the parlor, taking a seat and inviting him to do the same. He settled into an armchair and focused on Eliza. "I do have news. The person sending you the threatening letters was Jerome Black. He's Irene Gale's manager. We sang together several times. How could Jerome have been the one to send the letters? He was a nice man." He nodded. "That's correct. Apparently, he felt that if you were out of the way, Miss Gale would get some of the parts instead of you." She sighed. "He's always been so nice to me." Beulah came into the room with a tray with tea and the cookies they'd baked Sunday afternoon. Eliza took a cup and a plate of cookies, thankful for the distraction. What happens now? She'd had more dealings with the authorities in the past month than ever before in her life. She hoped it wasn't a trend that would keep going. "Mr. Black is in custody. You've given me the letters, and they're now in the custody of the police. A case will be built, and he'll go to trial. You're safe again, Mrs. Simpson." Eliza let out a breath. She could sing again. Anytime she wanted. In front of anyone she wanted to sing for. It was freeing. "Thank you, Mr. Bigelow. I do appreciate your time." He got to his feet. "I'm happy to be of service. Would you like to stay for lunch? It's just breakfast foods, but there's plenty of it." She couldn't let him leave without feeding him when he just brought her such wonderful news. "No, thank you. I have another train to catch." She stood, and he shook her hand. "It's been a pleasure meeting a singer of your caliber. I hope to hear you perform again someday." Eliza shook her head with a smile. "I'm afraid I won't be singing outside church any longer, Mr. Bigelow. I'm a wife and soon-to-be mother. I don't have time for singing any longer." She knew she wouldn't miss it either. Singing in a church was all she'd ever wanted, despite what people around her had wanted for her. The world will be missing out on a great talent. She walked him to the door, thanking him again. When he was gone, she ran across the room and hugged Beulah tightly. "It's over. The man who was threatening me is behind bars." She couldn't keep the joy from her voice. She wanted to dance a jig, but she'd never been a great dancer and didn't want to fall and harm the baby. Beulah smiled relief on her face. "My boys can go to school. I can sing in church. I can't wait to tell Calvin and not be guarded anymore." Eliza had no idea how oppressed she'd felt until the danger was over. Finally, she'd be able to be a normal housewife who just happened to like to sing in church. Nothing more. The door opened, and Calvin rushed inside. "Slater told me Mr. Bigelow came by. He didn't wait for me?" His eyes were panicked as they met Eliza's. Eliza smiled, her whole face lighting up. "He didn't need to wait. Everything's fine. The man who was threatening me is in jail awaiting trial. I'm free." Calvin smiled, finding her enthusiasm contagious. While they ate, she talked about singing in church again and about how much she'd missed it. The more she talked, the more Calvin's heart sank. She wanted to return to her old life of singing now that the danger was past. He could feel it. While they washed the lunch dishes, Beulah asked, what was wrong with Calvin during lunch? He seemed happy at first, but then he seemed to get sadder and sadder as the meal went by. "Do you know why?" Eliza looked at her sister with surprise. "He did? I wonder why." She'd been so caught up in her own excitement, she hadn't even noticed. "I'm not certain. Does he not want you singing in church?" Eliza frowned. She knew how Calvin felt about her singing, but he'd said he didn't mind when she sang in church. Had he been lying? She wanted to be able to at least sing for services, but if he didn't want her to, she wouldn't. He was more important to her than her singing. She'd never thought she'd be able to say that about a man. But with Calvin, it was true. Asterisk. Calvin spent the day working out how he was going to give Eliza her freedom. He knew she wanted to spend her life singing, but she felt tied down by him. Finally, he decided how he'd word the subject when he brought it up to her. He knew he could put it in a way that made her realize how very much he loved her and wanted her to be happy. With the house full of people they had, he would talk to her after they were in bed. It was their only private time. He'd give her the freedom she needed, but she'd know she could always come home to him. Asterisk. Eliza knew she needed to talk to Calvin once they were in bed that night. She had to tell him that if he didn't want her singing in church, then she wouldn't sing in church. His feelings were more important to her than singing for others. God had given her a talent, yes, but she could use it singing her babies to sleep at night. What higher calling was there than that? She waited for him in her nightgown that night, knowing he would be a while. He had taken to teaching the boys how to whittle at night, and he was in the middle of a lesson when she went up to bed. The baby was draining all her energy, and she was nodding off to sleep after dinner while she and Beulah were sewing. When he opened the door and blew out the lamp, she knew it was time for her to talk to him about his worries. Did he think he'd lose her because other men would hear her voice? "I won't sing in church again. I know you don't like it." She decided to just be blunt. It would be the easiest way to get the conversation started. Calvin turned to the bed in surprise, dropping the last of his clothes in a heap on the floor, knowing she'd pick them up in the morning. "What are you talking about?" He climbed into bed beside her, pulling her close. "I know you were upset at lunch today when I was talking about how I was free to sing in church again. I don't want to do anything that would upset you. I love to sing, but you're more important than anything." She hated that he was jealous of her singing, but she didn't know what to do about it other than stop singing. Calvin kissed the top of her head. "You think I was upset because you want to sing in church? Where did she get her ideas?" Eliza shrugged, snuggling close to him in the dark. "I know you're upset about something, and I can't think what else it could be. I thought you'd be happy when the danger was past. I spent all day thinking about how I was going to offer you your freedom. I was sure now that your family was no longer in danger that you'd want to go back on the road." Eliza chuckled. "There's nothing I want less." She suddenly stiffened, realizing what he was saying. "You don't want to be married anymore? You want me to leave?" She'd thought he wanted her around. He wasn't upset about her singing in church. He was done with her. "No. I want you to know that I love you enough to set you free. I was thinking you could be on the road part-time and could be here part-time. I would hire someone to take care of the baby who would travel with you while you're gone. I want you with me always, but I won't keep you locked up when you want to be able to sing." He'd even considered going on the road with her, but he'd worked too hard to build up his ranch to be able to do that. "Oh, Calvin. I love you too. All I've ever wanted was to sing at church when the mood struck me. I never wanted to travel around singing endlessly." She pressed a kiss to his lips, her hand stroking his shoulders. "Even with the danger I've been in, I found more happiness here with you in the last 3 months than I had in the 16 years I traveled and sang. You make me happy. Not singing. So if you're all right with me singing at church, then I'll do it. If you're not, I won't. Our marriage is too important to throw away just so I can sing at church once a month." He dropped his forehead onto hers, having a hard time believing she cared enough for him to give him that choice. "I liked it when you sang in church. I was very proud of you." "Good. Then I will continue to sing in church, but that's all." She shook her head. "I can't believe you were going to let me travel half the time. What were you thinking?" I was thinking I love you so much that I'll take what I can get. You don't have to, because I love you just as much. Epilogue. Eliza stared down into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. The baby lay contentedly in her arms right after a feeding. She'd expected him to fall asleep while eating, but he hadn't. Her little angel was still awake, returning her gaze. It was a quiet morning in mid-September. Beulah had come over to help with the birthing, but she had left an hour or so before to get some sleep. She'd promised to be back in a few hours to help her, and that she'd come every day for a few days until Eliza got into a good routine with the baby. "What should we name him?" she asked. Calvin was leaning over her shoulder looking at the boy. "He's so alert." "Is that normal?" He'd never been this close to a baby before. Eliza shrugged. "I don't know. I've never really been around babies much, but I'd guess it was normal." She hoped it was normal. He seemed normal in every other way. "I thought you hated all my names." Every name he'd suggest for the past 8 months had been shot down with haste. Now she was asking for help naming him. What was wrong with her? "How would you feel about naming him Walton after the man who helped me get away from Sebastian? We could name him Walton Calvin Simpson and call him Walt for short." Calvin felt a smile cross his lips. "Walton Calvin? You don't want to name him Walton Dalton?" He still wanted to laugh every time the man's name came up. "I'm not that cruel. I think Walton Calvin is a fitting name for him. Walt for short. Or Wally even. Wally will fit better while he's still a baby." Eliza couldn't believe that the perfect baby in her arms had grown inside her. "I can't wait until Beulah's baby is born. They'll only be 4 months apart." She was happy for her sister. "How are the boys doing about it?" I know Jack wasn't thrilled at first. "Oh, they're both happy now. Jack says he always wanted a little brother or sister. He doesn't know where we got the idea that he didn't want one." She grinned over her shoulder at him. Calvin reached out and put his finger to the baby's, marveling at the way Wally reached out and grabbed it. "He's strong already. I've been telling you that for months." His kicks were very powerful. Eliza was tired, but happy. She'd never imagined such a small person could make her so very happy. "Do you still want a dozen now that you know what childbirth is like?" He'd spent hours pacing downstairs waiting for news on whether the baby was a boy or a girl. He wasn't sure he could go through childbirth again, but he would leave it up to his wife. She smiled. "I don't know about a dozen, but looking down at him, I certainly want more. It's like all the pain just washed away as soon as Beulah put him in my arms. I'm glad she was able to help you. You never told me she was studying to be a midwife back east." "I didn't know until after she got here." Eliza hated that she hadn't known. There were many things Beulah had written her about over the years that she didn't know. The only thing she could guess was that Sebastian had been keeping her sister's letters from her. She was so glad he was locked up for the rest of his life and would never be able to treat another woman the way he'd treated her. "She wrote me about it, but I never received the letter." Calvin shook his head. "That man has a lot to answer for. He's answering for it in prison, and he'll answer for it again when he meets his maker." Calvin wished he could be as forgiving as Eliza had been. He wished he could go to 2 different prisons and thrash both of the men who had made her life so difficult. He knew it would do no good, but it was what he desperately wanted. He looked at the baby again and thanked God for new beginnings. If Eliza hadn't been poised to run away from Sebastian the day she'd received the threat, would she have married him? Would his life have been different? He didn't know. He leaned forward and kissed Eliza's shoulder. "I'm glad you're in my life. No matter what happened in the past, that's what's important. You're mine now." Eliza smiled. "I couldn't agree more." Epilogue. Eliza stared down into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. The baby lay contentedly in her arms right after a feeding. She'd expected him to fall asleep while eating, but he hadn't. Her little angel was still awake, returning her gaze. It was a quiet morning in mid-September. Beulah had come over to help with the birthing, but she had left an hour or so before to get some sleep. She'd promised to be back in a few hours to help her, and that she'd come every day for a few days until Eliza got into a good routine with the baby. "What should we name him?" she asked. Calvin was leaning over her shoulder looking at the boy. "He's so alert." "Is that normal?" He'd never been this close to a baby before. Eliza shrugged. "I don't know. I've never really been around babies much, but I'd guess it was normal." She hoped it was normal. He seemed normal in every other way. "I thought you hated all my names." Every name he'd suggest for the past 8 months had been shot down with haste. Now she was asking for help naming him. What was wrong with her? "How would you feel about naming him Walton after the man who helped me get away from Sebastian? We could name him Walton Calvin Simpson and call him Walt for short." Calvin felt a smile cross his lips. "Walton Calvin? You don't want to name him Walton Dalton?" He still wanted to laugh every time the man's name came up. "I'm not that cruel. I think Walton Calvin is a fitting name for him. Walt for short. Or Wally even. Wally will fit better while he's still a baby." Eliza couldn't believe that the perfect baby in her arms had grown inside her. "I can't wait until Beulah's baby is born. They'll only be 4 months apart." She was happy for her sister. "How are the boys doing about it?" I know Jack wasn't thrilled at first. "Oh, they're both happy now. Jack says he always wanted a little brother or sister. He doesn't know where we got the idea that he didn't want one." She grinned over her shoulder at him. Calvin reached out and put his finger to the baby's, marveling at the way Wally reached out and grabbed it. "He's strong already. I've been telling you that for months." His kicks were very powerful. Eliza was tired, but happy. She'd never imagined such a small person could make her so very happy. "Do you still want a dozen now that you know what childbirth is like?" He'd spent hours pacing downstairs waiting for news on whether the baby was a boy or a girl. He wasn't sure he could go through childbirth again, but he would leave it up to his wife. She smiled. "I don't know about a dozen, but looking down at him, I certainly want more. It's like all the pain just washed away as soon as Beulah put him in my arms. I'm glad she was able to help you. You never told me she was studying to be a midwife back east." "I didn't know until after she got here." Eliza hated that she hadn't known. There were many things Beulah had written her about over the years that she didn't know. The only thing she could guess was that Sebastian had been keeping her sister's letters from her. She was so glad he was locked up for the rest of his life and would never be able to treat another woman the way he'd treated her. "She wrote me about it, but I never received the letter." Calvin shook his head. "That man has a lot to answer for. He's answering for it in prison, and he'll answer for it again when he meets his maker." Calvin wished he could be as forgiving as Eliza had been. He wished he could go to 2 different prisons and thrash both of the men who had made her life so difficult. He knew it would do no good, but it was what he desperately wanted. He looked at the baby again and thanked God for new beginnings. If Eliza hadn't been poised to run away from Sebastian the day she'd received the threat, would she have married him? Would his life have been different? He didn't know. He leaned forward and kissed Eliza's shoulder. "I'm glad you're in my life. No matter what happened in the past, that's what's important. You're mine now." Eliza smiled. "I couldn't agree more." Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed, please give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and ring the bell to be notified of more audiobooks.